As we ended last week, I was alluding to the similarities between our present day American society. In your outline, the word is American in the society that was prevalent at the time of the Tower of Babel. You can paint a picture of America that looks a lot like Babel. Essentially, there's really no difference. We've turned our back on God. We've rejected the truth that is known, and it has then plunged us into sexual immorality, homosexuality, perversions, reprobate minds, and all the things that we looked at last week in Romans 1. Okay? And you know, I've decided, we hear so much about how America's going down the drain, about what's wrong with our nation, how we need to call our nation to God, how we've got to do that. But I've come to a conclusion. I don't have a message for America. I don't have anything to say to America. I don't have anything to say to my congressman. I don't have anything to say to our senators. I don't have anything to say to our governor. I have nothing to say to the authorities. I don't have a message anymore for America. And I don't believe that's our calling, to have a message for America. What I do have is a message for individuals. In your outline, the word is individuals. Why don't I have a message for America? Well, because it has plunged headfirst into idolatry. It has minds that are reprobate. And there can be no expectation of a nation living to a divine standard unless there are individuals that can attempt to live to a divine standard. It's not possible for a nation to change unless the individuals change first. So I don't have a message for America. I'm not going to call America to anything. I'm going to try to remember that. As I studied this, the Lord impressed that upon my heart. What we need to do, you and I, is to call sinners to repentance. Okay? Anybody got a comment?
One word for America, and that's repent. And they're not listening. The greatest evangelist of our modern era passed away this morning.
More people have heard the gospel today from that news coverage than heard it in a long time around.
You know how Billy Graham learned how to preach, don't you?
Pardon me?
You know how he learned how to preach?
How he learned how to.
Yeah.
Listening to his dad, probably.
He used to go out and preach to animals.
Yeah, he lived on a dairy farm.
Yeah. He used to preach to anything that was alive. That's how we learn. That's how we get comfortable. So don't get caught up in the idea of trying to fix America. Get caught up in the idea of trying to fix individuals. Don't send. There's people that are asking for money to help evangelize America. I would be very, very careful in giving my money to that endeavor. Because I don't think there's anything to indicate that there's going to be any national godliness unless there's a revival. And how does a revival start?
Individually.
It usually starts with one person. So, and you know, everybody says we've got to reform. That's a good word. We have to reform our cities and stop criminality. How are you going to stop criminality? You're not going to stop criminality.
Kill all the criminals.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, me and John will run the court. But unregenerate people are wicked and wretched, and they themselves, they can't restrain themselves. What Jeremiah 17:9 say? The heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. And then it says, who can know it? You know what that means, who can know it? That the man who is deceitful and wicked doesn't know he's deceitful and wicked. He thinks he's normal. So I don't have a message for America, not tonight. The gospel is a gospel that I think is for individuals. And, you know, I preach to crowds all the time, but the message is not a message to a national entity. It's a message to individual souls. So I threw all of that in there for nothing, because when I was writing today, I got worked up about it. So I wrote it on my word processor, and I thought I'd talk about it. I feel better now, though. So you remember and understand that picture in Romans chapter 1 that we talked about last week. What happens to a people, what happens to a society, is that they turn their back on God. And because they do that, they become adulterous. They become idol worshipers. They think they're wise when they're actually fools. They plunge into chaos, and they are then, in Romans 1, described with all forms of sexual immorality, which we've experienced in America. And then they become mentally depraved, and they have degraded minds and everything that issues out of those things. And that's the kind of society that was alive and well in Genesis 11. And that's the kind of society that's alive and well in America in 2018. So, Genesis 11, we'll go back there. And they did, at the time of Babel, remember there was just one people, that's what verse 1 says. They used the same language, same vocabulary, same words, one nation. And then the separation that's described in the previous chapter 10 hasn't been launched until God disperses the people at Babel. So as the story of Babel begins, there's still one word, one world, one language, one nation, one ruler. Who's the ruler of Babel? Nimrod. So what you have is one society. Everybody walking, almost everybody walking to the same sheet of music. So you end up with unrestrained wickedness. Concentrated, unencumbered, unhindered evil. And so God says, I can't allow that. And I've told you before, and I'll say it again, I'll reiterate it again. That's what the New Age movement wants. You know that? They want one world. Almost all of our modern politicians speak of one world. You know that? It doesn't matter what party they're in. They almost all speak of one world. And that's a serious problem, and that's big. That has the potential for great trouble. Because you know what happens when we get one world? There's going to be how many leaders? One. And he'll be Antichrist, and so Satan looks forward to one world because it would be easier for him to get his way that way. But the Lord, in an act of common grace as well as his judgment, has taken issue with that before. And in Genesis 11, we see him scatter the people. Verse 3. And remember now, what we're looking at here in verse 3 are the actions of men. Later on, we'll look at the actions of God. But these are the actions of men. Verse 3, it says, come, let us. Verse 4, it says, come, let us. And this is the action of man. They found a place in the land of Shinar, a plain that would be in the Mesopotamian valley between the Tigris and Euphrates River, near the original Garden of Eden. And they find this nice place, and without any regard for God, they say, come, let us. Do they ask God? There's no inference. Doesn't look like it. Do they pray about it? not that we know of. There's no deference to God. There's no indication of any worship of God. God told them to cover, God had told them what were they supposed to do? Cover the face of the earth. And they said, let's build for ourselves. Let's build for ourselves. Not for the glory of God, but for ourselves. So remember, this idea of for ourselves, this is their social action, remember? They're going to build for themselves, and your outline, the word is social. Concentrated, a group of concentrated sinners, corrupting each other like a mass of people, like, I think it was 2 weeks ago on Friday, Tiff said that in JP's class, 17 out of 34 kids were absent. Everybody keeps infecting everybody with everything. That's kind of the school environment. And that's kind of this environment here where everybody's all together in one place speaking the same language, and they are infecting themselves with evil. And evil, when it's put upon itself, intensifies. And that's the picture. And they wanted a city because they wanted that social notoriety. Are cities usually hotbeds of evil? Look at Chicago. Yeah. And then what was the second thing they wanted? They wanted a city, and then what else did they want? They wanted a tower, a ziggurat. And archaeologists have found more than 30 ziggurats in the Mesopotamian Valley. They were common structures in that part of the world in the Babylonian, Akkadian culture. And they were used to symbolize a connection between man and God as they built them higher and higher. They weren't trying to walk to heaven, but it was a symbol of their connection with the gods. And these towers throughout Babylonian culture were religious. In your outline, the word is religious in nature. Sometimes it was on the very top, they would stick an idol. Generally all around the bottom or in a certain place on the bottom in the entryway, there would be a temple. And when it says it went into the heavens or it touched the heavens, that's an idea of trying to be in contact with the God. And you know, I've read a lot about the Babylonian mystery religions, if you will, which literally spread all over the earth and took idolatry over the entire face of the earth. And they are, in fact, I believe, all traceable back to Babylon, which is traceable back to Babel. In Babylonia, every important city had a ziggurat, even Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. A symbol, something that the idea coming down from Babel. So Nimrod not only was a great hunter, a killer of people, he was an intimidator, but he apparently knew that people needed religion. If he was going to overcome their knowledge of God, they needed a false religion to substitute for the truth. And that's very, very commonplace. What does a cult do? It substitutes falsehoods for the truth. So in a very classic Romans 1 type fashion, Nimrod set up a system where people were able to deny the true God and live in unrighteousness. They didn't want to be righteous. They didn't like God's standards. So they denied the true God and they created gods. They created gods that would accept their sins. That's what people do all the time. People do it today. Create a God that'll accept your sins. And the Bible actually traces all false religion back to Babylon. And I believe then from Babylon you can trace it back to Babel. They rejected the true God. They developed their false gods, and the Babylonian mystery cults come out of that are spread all over the world. When you get into the book of Revelation at the very end of human history, at the time of the tribulation, just before the return of Jesus Christ in chapter 17, verse 5, it says, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. That idea of mother of harlots is, it means that Babylon is the mother of all religious abominations. If you want to know the origin of the Roman Catholic, what I call the mother cult, the worshiping of Mary, that is not a New Testament occurrence. That is an occurrence that goes all the way back into the Babylonian mystery religions. Even in the time of Ezekiel, there were false teachers who were preaching, worshiping the Queen of Heaven before Mary was ever around. And that Queen of Heaven has gone by many different names: Isis, Semiramis, Astrology, and many different cult-type religions. So what kind of religion was it that they developed at the tower? Well, there's a lot of interesting thought about it. Jim Boyce, I don't know if any of you know Jim Boyce. He was a very good commentarian, noted for his writing on the authority of Scripture and in his defense of biblical inerrancy. He came to the conclusion, after years of research, that the religion that was started at Babel and went on to Babylon was astrology, the zodiac. Okay? And that goes back all the way to Babel. And he writes, quote, you can turn to any book on astrology and you will find that it came from the Chaldeans. And who are the Chaldeans? That's another name for Babylonians. They developed the first zodiac by dividing the sky into sections and giving meanings to each on the basis of the stars that they found there. A person's destiny is said to be determined by whatever section or sign they were born under. And most of us are aware of that, right? What's your sign? I'm a Taurus. Pisces. You know, Gemini, whatever. And Boyce goes on, he says, from Babylon, astrology passed on to the empire of ancient Egypt, where it mingled with the Egyptians practiced a lot of animal worship. And they had many, I don't know how many, they had a boatload of gods on the Nile. And the pyramids were then constructed with certain mathematical relationships in regards to the stars. The Sphinx, that lion-looking thing, has an astrological significance. Did you know that? It has the head of a woman who symbolizes Virgo, the Virgin, and it has the body of a lion symbolizing Leo. You know what the first sign of the zodiac is? Virgo. The last, Leo. So the Sphinx, the word that's from the Greek, the word that we would use there, in the Greek it means joining. So in the picture of the Sphinx is a joining of the zodiac from first to last. And that just indicates that Egyptians priests believed the starting point of the earth in relation to the zodiac was started right there in Egypt on the banks of the Nile. That was their belief, because everybody wants to be the best. So you can trace all this fascinating study of the zodiac back to Babylon, through Egypt, and very likely all the way back to Babel, going that way, Egypt going that way. And by the time the Jews came out of Egypt after 400 years, they had been greatly influenced by astrology. Did you know that? They were very into, in fact, there's still Jewish sects today of Judaism that are very into astrology, okay? They're following something that was invented by Babylonian pagans, but So when the Israelites left Egypt, because of the amount of influence that had been brought to bear on them to believe in the stars, there are in the Word of God numerous warnings. In Leviticus, God says in 1931, do not turn to mediums or spiritualists. That's a general type term. It would include those who read the stars. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. So God is saying, don't go near these people. Deuteronomy 18:9. When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes her son or daughter pass through the fire. A literal description of the burning of children on the arms of, what's that guy's name? They used to put a fire in his stomach and he gets so hot. The children would pretty much. And then it says, don't go near anyone who practices witchcraft or soothsayer or one who interprets omens or a sorcerer. And for that word sorcerer, some versions will use astrologer. And it continues, don't go near anyone who conjures spells or a medium or a spiritist or one who calls up the dead. That's a necromancer. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. That's why they were supposed to wipe their face out. Verse 14, for these nations which you will dispossess have listened to soothsayers and diviners, but as for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you. A warning. Later on in the Bible, book of Daniel, Daniel 1:20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined. Now we're up in the time of Babylon, or Chaldea, if you will. And then it says, he, this being the king's servant, found Daniel and his friends that they were 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers. Some versions will use the word conjurers there, just referring to how these astrologers were so inept, but they were part of the court of the king of Babylon. Astrologers are mentioned again with magicians in Daniel 2, verse 2, again in verse 10, again in verse 27. They're in chapter 4, chapter 5, I think 3 times there. So astrology has deep roots in Babylon. I believe those roots began in Babel, find their way to Babylon, find their way to Egypt, even infect to some degree the people of Israel, and has still influence around the world today. And the interesting thing about these biblical denunciations of astrology is that astrology is identified with demonism. They had these figures are considered to be gods. Satan and his demons were actually being worshipped under the guise of the signs in the stars and the planets. So you might want to remember that. But the reason for the Bible's stern denunciation, and that's the reason for the Bible's stern denunciation of astrology. Okay? Not astronomy, but astrology. Although, are we to think that, listen, this was the first truly false religion on earth, if you will, at Babel. Do you think Satan was absent from that religion? No. He was right in the middle of it. Okay? The first non-biblical religion. The tower, if you will, was a satanic attempt to direct the worship of the human race to Satan and the former angels who had rebelled against God and now were demons. Henry Morris, a lot of you know Henry Morris, the creationist. He writes, this project originally presented to the people in the guise of true spirituality. He's saying Nimrod portrayed the Ziggurat and all that pertains to it as a spiritual endeavor. He continues, the tower with its lofty grandeur would symbolize the might and majesty of the true God of heaven. A great temple at its apex would provide a center and an altar where men could offer their sacrifices and worship God. And then, but Morris then says, the signs of the zodiac would have been emblazoned on the ornate ceilings and walls of that temple, signifying the great story of creation and redemption as told by the antediluvian patriarchs. The antediluvian patriarchs are pre-flood. So what Morse is saying is that they use the sign of the zodiac to portray creation and redemption, which is really out there. And but that's a very popular idea of what had transpired with these ziggurats. And do you know that's been a popular idea in modern Christianity? There's a book by a guy named Kennedy in Florida that talks about the gospel in the stars.
James Kennedy?
I'm not sure if it's James or not. It might be James Kennedy. It's a whole book that's written about this idea. And I think it's something like the Bible is God's little book and the stars are God's big book. And I don't think the stars have anything to do with the gospel. Do you? I'll tell you what the stars have to do with. They declare the glory of God according to creation. Why in the world would you need to borrow a pagan concoction and somehow invest it with the gospel? But there are Christian astrologists. There are. I believe there's, I know there used to be, I believe there are several still. Red Rocks, what is it?
Sedona?
Sedona, yeah.
That's pretty evil up there.
That's a real den of evil. Christian astrologists. Wow. Those are like oxymorons. But finding the gospel in the stars is nothing more than a fantasy, and worse than that, it's borrowing from paganism. So, back to Genesis 11 then. They also wanted a name, okay? Their social goal was a city, and so they wanted a name for themselves, and socially they wanted to have a city. Religiously, they wanted to have this tower, and their psychological goal was the name. If they had a city, and they had a tower, then they would have a name. It says, let us make a name for ourselves. It's kind of like, instead of God, we're going to dethrone him, we're going to make a name for ourselves. And it's again a picture of Romans 1. Let's take God down from his throne. We can get so powerful and so self-enamored that we can make a name for ourselves, and then it says, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.
Speaking of being enamored with oneself, did you hear LeBron James's statement? He said, I am so important that the public needs to know my political thoughts. Yeah, they were entitled to that. I thought, well, I don't need to know it. How can anybody be that stupid?
Well.
Well, yeah, okay, that's a bad question. It's prevalent.
The only thing that Laura Ingraham did wrong is that she gave him more notoriety, because he's something else. And that's where we're going, though.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the people that are gonna end up running America. Yeah. So, why would these people say that they want, that we gotta make a name for ourselves or we'll be scattered abroad? What would make them think that was going to happen? Well, God had told them to scatter abroad. So they knew they were doing what was wrong. And back in Genesis 9:1, what did he say? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They're not filling the earth. They're filling the Mesopotamian valley. I wonder how many times Noah preached on be fruitful and multiply. Because Noah's alive, okay? I don't know how many times he might have preached it, but he was a preacher of righteousness, the word tells us. I know after the flood, after God told him, he must have preached it. How many times would he have? You could look at the outline on the bulletin, and it would say, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Get going, folks. Start spreading out there. But they said, nope. They just wanted to be. See, they wanted to be totally self-sufficient. They wanted to be strong. They wanted to be socially adept. They wanted to build a strong religious base to hold everybody together. Strong psychologically. They wanted to boost up their self-esteem. So they thought that we're going to really be something as long as we don't get scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. We've got to hang on to things tightly so God can't move us around. And that is nothing more than pure disobedience and defiance. There's no other explanation for it. And in your outline, the word is rebellion. Their rebellion is motivated by the fact that they know what God wants and they refuse to do it. So they're just rebellious. They make up their own bizarre religion, which as I've said, I believe it included the zodiac and sectioning off the stars and creating gods for each section and living by the one thing we see all over the face of the earth. You see these temples that are all mathematically aligned with the stars, if you will. And the origin of all those temples are the Ziggurats of Babel. And that's why that astrology stuff and that Australian stuff is bad for you. Because don't get near any of that stuff. When I was lost, I used to read my horoscope every day. Horoscope. Scope. You could see the future. What's going on in your life. So that reflects, that then ends this section, which is on the actions of mankind. And then next week we'll start the section on the actions of God against the rebellion at Babel. All right?